Robby, what's on your radar today?
Well, I've got another student loan debt radar, but I think you'll agree with this one, most of this one, Brianna. So last week, President Biden announced that he would forgive up to $20,000 of student loan debt for qualifying borrowers who make less than $125,000 per year. But that wasn't all. Biden also said he would create a new income-driven repayment system for college borrowers, IDR for short. The IDR aspect of Biden's plan attracted less scrutiny than the direct forgiveness aspect, which will cost at least $300 billion in the immediate future. But in the long term, this aggressive move toward an income-driven model of repaying college loans will probably have a bigger impact, and that impact could be catastrophic. In fact, unless the government does something else to constrain colleges and universities' ability to set their own prices, IDR could break the entire higher education financing system and lead to skyrocketing costs for taxpayers. There are some IDR programs available right now, but Biden's approach would vastly expand this option. So the existing plans require borrowers to pay 10, 15, or 20% of their income for 2 decades, at which point the rest of the loan is forgiven. So Biden would make IDR much more appealing than it is currently. So according to the Biden-Harris debt relief plan, borrowers will pay just 5% of their income, or 10% if they took out graduate student loans, for either 10 or 20 years, depending on how much money they owe. The income threshold will be raised from 150% above the poverty line to 225%, which covers a lot more people, and the punitive interest rates are going to be eliminated. So all in all, this IDR model will be extremely appealing for a large number of borrowers. It's a great deal. We should expect the percentage of borrowers who are repaying via that method to increase substantially in the coming years. But without further changes to the federal student loan program, this is actually going to be a huge problem. That's because both the borrowers and the universities will have increased incentive to bilk the people who actually make the loans, the taxpayers. So let's get into this. Under the current system, a prospective student needs a certain amount of money to pay for tuition at a university. Let's say it's $50,000. They borrow that sum from the government, i.e. the taxpayers. Later, the borrower pays it back with interest. The university's incentives are already less than ideal. Might feel free to raise the price of tuition to, let's say, $60,000, satisfied that the student really wants the degree and will thus borrow more money and deal with the consequences afterward. To the extent that the government loan program disguises upfront costs, it arguably already contributes to rising tuition rates. Multiple economic studies have found that this is the case. Under IDR, though, this situation is going to get much worse because now the university and the borrowers have incentive to cooperate and screw the taxpayers. So for the borrower, it actually doesn't matter if tuition costs $15,000 or $5 million. The borrower will be repaying the same amount, 5% of income for 10 years, regardless of the size of the loan or the cost of tuition. Since it makes no difference to the borrower, the university might as well raise prices astronomically. This way, the university pockets more money, and the borrower doesn't even have to pay it back. Something close to this scheme already exists in law schools, which have loan repayment assistance programs, LRAPs, L-R-A-P-S. According to the leftist writer Matt Brunig, who was the inspiration for a lot of this radar, the arrangement is very likely to produce increased tuition as universities and students figure out that they can essentially cooperate in this game to beat the house. Brunig writes, just as schools have new incentives to push debt loads higher in an IDR-dominated world, so do students. Above, I say that for students planning to enroll in IDR, $15,000 of student debt is no different than $100,000 of student debt. This is not quite right, though. A student planning to enroll in IDR actually benefits from taking the maximum amount of debt possible. Student loans are initially paid to schools to cover tuition and fees, but what's left after tuition and fees is dispersed as cash to the students, ostensibly to cover living expenses. In a conventional student loan, you have reason to live frugally and take out as little debt as possible. But if you're planning to go on IDR, then your incentive flips and you're leaving money on the table if you don't take out the maximum loan possible. Brunig notes that Australia also uses IDR, but in Australia, the government prohibits universities from charging obscenely high tuition rates. If we're going to make the leap into an IDR-dominant college financing system, then we may need the government to also play a much bigger role in setting college prices, something it probably should have been doing even before the Biden policy change, writes Brunig. Otherwise, we may very well see more unwanted cost bloat beyond what we already have. So Brunig approaches these issues from the left, but he's not wrong that these policies make for a dreaded combination. And let's be clear what these 3 policies are. 1, letting students get publicly subsidized loans. 2, allowing the borrowers to pay a percentage of their income instead of paying back the entire loan. And 3, permitting universities to charge whatever the hell they want for tuition. The result is that tuition will be meaningless as a pricing signal, and institutions will have no reason whatsoever to keep costs down. On the contrary, they'd be foolish not to jack up tuition prices, since the broken loan system would be functioning as basically a direct wealth transfer from taxpayers to university coffers. One solution would be for the government, at a minimum, to set tuition prices for public state universities, which, after all, are public utilities paid for by taxpayers. So, from my perspective, it's not unlibertarian or anti-free market to think that if the state is going to confiscate wealth from taxpayers in order to maintain public educational institutions, those institutions should be generally affordable to those same taxpayers. Another idea would be to move to a system in which students don't take out loans at all. Instead of paying tuition, they agree to pay a percentage of their income to the university for some length of time after graduation. This would be like income-driven repayment, but it would cut out the government as the middleman and thus get taxpayers off the hook. So Purdue University President Mitch Daniels did experiment with something just like this, though it was paused earlier this year due to implementation difficulties. Something has to be done, though, or else IDR is likely to become a significant problem. By encouraging students to take on even more debt and then never expecting them to repay it at all, the Biden administration is creating a system where everyone involved in higher education has incentive to fleece the American people. And that's scary, because it's already the student loan system is shown to increase the prices because it's disguising that you're paying it later so the university can trick you a little bit. But here, if you're not paying back the loan anyway, you're going to pay back part of your income, which is a fine system. That is a better system. But the universities will just they have no reason not to raise it.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's why it's such a shame that there hasn't been more appetite before this point from conservatives, Democrats, libertarians, anyone really, except for the progressive left, to get to the bottom of these kinds of problems by implementing a plan like the one Bernie put forward years ago to make public colleges and universities tuition free. If we're going to be sinking all of this money into education, to your point, it should be to make education broadly affordable to everyone, the same way that we guarantee K through 12 for free for American citizens. Rightly or wrongly, like it or not, we live in a world where a growing number of jobs require higher education, not just because it's a feather in your cap and it makes you feel good, but because jobs require training. And we want people in this country to be able to do the kind of jobs we're now bringing back home, like these semiconductor jobs. We want people to be trained to do these vocations, like, you don't roll in a bed and be an electrician. These are jobs that are highly skilled, and people need to respect the education and the cost of the education that goes into getting vocational degrees. Public colleges and universities, I would argue, need to be tuition free, and Bernie had a plan to have a small tax on Wall Street transactions in order to fund exactly that, and to shift all of this money going into these federal grant programs over to simply making colleges and universities tuition free, at which point, if someone opts to go to a public institution, they're on their own, or a private institution rather, they're on their own. And also what that will do is help to flatten some of the gross inequity that happens between people who go to these elite private schools and people who go to public schools. In other countries with similar models, something that Matt Bruning also writes a lot about, Scandinavian models in education and healthcare and a lot of different kinds of things, there is less of that jockeying and brinkmanship over what school is like this much higher in the Princeton Review, and you got these celebrities in the United States of America who are already millionaires cheating and doing federal crimes and going to jail just so their little princess can get into like a marginally better school. So I completely agree. We've got to get to the root of the system.
In terms of the free college, you and I aren't as far apart on this issue as our viewers might expect, given that it is really a progressive or a left policy. But I mean, I agree that there's no a public educational institution, a university, like there's no reason that it shouldn't be at least, if not free, at least affordable to the very children of the people whose tax money is taken to fund it.
Yeah.
So it doesn't. Yeah. And so through K through 12, the funding model for schools that are public schools, they receive an allotment from the government, based on how many kids are enrolled. It's different in different jurisdictions. But something like that, so there is a limit basically on how much money these schools are getting, serving as serving a public educational role, what they're getting from the government. Then when we move to the colleges and universities that said, no, they're setting whatever they want. They have no oversight. Yeah, can you imagine if a state legislature? I mean, I wish this would happen, but a state legislature said, "Sorry, University of Michigan, you can't raise, like, it's unaffordable to the people who live here. You have to you can't remodel that dorm and add like a lazy river ride like you'd like to and raise tuition by 10% again. We're not going to let you do that."
Look, I will say this: a lot of colleges are actually experiencing some pretty harsh funding issues where it's not a lot of the excess that people point to. There's certainly excesses, and I have no interest in DEI. I'm not a big fan of those kinds of policies. I think they're just glorified HR for the most part and don't do anything to help the well-being of the students on campus. But, there was a strike, not a strike, but like a tent sleep out, protest at Howard last year where students were protesting the fact that they had mold, like medically problematic mold in their dorms and like rodent infestations because they couldn't get the funding to remodel the dorms. I mean, there's some really serious issues happening at college campuses that I don't want to be dismissive of, but it's worth noting how we got here from a historical trajectory. It wasn't that people woke up one day and said, "Oh, let's just do this federal grant funding model." We had a country that had public institutions that were incredibly valuable. The University of California system was the crown jewel of the country, and people were able to go in and get an education for just a few $100s a year. I recently watched a viral clip on Bill Maher where Rob Reiner, the director actor, was talking about how he went to the UC system back in I think the 70s and paid a few $100s and got a great education. That world disappeared, and not by accident. It was because Ronald Reagan as governor and Nixon as president, they understood that the movements from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, all of the equality movements, the civil rights movements, the women's rights movements, were gestating in these college campuses. And as part of their political agenda, they decided to sacrifice our entire educational system so that they could win politically. And so there's a great article right now by John Schwartz in the Intercept about that. If people want to read about it in more detail, maybe we should have him on as a guest. But the reality is that we're making choices as a society about who carries the burden of these kinds of things. And I think you're completely right to want to try to right the ship now.
We can hold the institutions accountable. I mean, they, at no point, most of these institutions have, on an administrative level, have showed zero interest in keeping down costs,
and
controlling
costs.
Why should
they when they can get these federal dollars?
Right,
I completely agree. One last point to mention is that the reason we are talking about student debt cancellation right now and not a more holistic system of review, which I entirely support and have been fighting for years in the context of the Bernie campaign and outside of it, is because Joe Biden has the authority to cancel student debt by executive order. And again, it's really important. It's really important to emphasize this. Like, a lot of people are raising, well, there's other kinds of debt. There are people who are poor. There are people who should get helped first. And I completely agree and have been fighting to cancel medical debt and have been arguing for years that those two policies should be tied together, exactly for this reason, because rhetorically it makes a lot more sense to deal with the more traumatized population. However, he cannot do that without congressional authority. So to the extent that people want those kinds of initiatives and want to get at the bottom of the student debt crisis and reform education, generally speaking, you got to talk to your Congress members.
I will concede that there's more, I guess, public buy-in to the idea that Biden can do this unilaterally, cancel student debt. I don't know if he actually can, and we'll see what the court has to say about it. And Nancy Pelosi, previously didn't think he had the authority to do it, but we'll see.
Nancy Pelosi was too busy counting her husband's PPP loan money. But
installing a breathalyzer on his steering wheel, perhaps, as well.
Robbie. But look, the reality is that the exact same authority that's been used to have the student debt moratorium for 2 years, Donald Trump's student debt moratorium, I think he should get credit for that. It's not clear to me that a Democrat would have done that, and it was a huge help. But Donald Trump's student debt moratorium is enacted under the exact same authority that the student debt cancellation is enacted under. It's just an indefinite, permanent moratorium. That's all it is.
Well, we'll see if that one would hold up in court. Well, more Rising right after this.